Sarah did not cry when she left home. She stood at the edge of Silver Hollow's territory, a single bag over her shoulder, and she looked back once, at the low wooden houses, at the pine trees she had climbed as a child, at her father's pale face watching her from the doorway. His wound had not closed in 3 weeks. His wolf was fading. The healers had stopped pretending otherwise. She turned around and kept walking. The Iron Crest soldiers waited for her at the border with horses and silence. They did not speak to her. They did not need to. She already knew what she was. She was a signature, a seal on a piece of paper that would stop people from dying. There were worse things to be, she decided. She had seen the worst things. She had helped carry them home in the dark. The ride to Iron Crest took 2 days. The land changed slowly. Silver Hollow's soft hills and wide rivers gave way to something harder, colder, more angular. The trees grew taller and darker. The air smelled of pine and stone. Somewhere on the second morning, as frost began to appear on the grass, Sarah noticed that she felt something strange. Not fear, not excitement. Something older than both of those things. Something that lived below her ribs and had no proper name. Her wolf shifted inside her, just slightly, the way an animal turns its head toward a sound it recognizes. She told herself it was nothing. Iron Crest's fortress rose out of the mountain like it had always been there, like the mountain had simply decided to become a building one day. Black stone, pale windows, a gate tall enough to swallow carriages whole. It was not beautiful in any soft sense of the word, but it had a kind of permanence that Sarah, who had spent 3 years watching everything she knew become uncertain, found unexpectedly comforting. She was brought to the great hall. He stood with his back to her. Chaol Draven, Alpha King of the Iron Crest Dominion, ruler of 7 packs, subject of more rumors than any one man could reasonably deserve, and he stood at the tall window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains, as though she had not arrived at all. He was broad across the shoulders. His hair was dark. He did not move. Sarah waited for approximately 4 seconds. "You could at least pretend to welcome your bride, King," she said. He turned around. He had storm-gray eyes. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was the expression in them, because for one brief moment, less than a breath, something moved behind them. Something that looked, strangely, like recognition. Then it was gone, and his face was perfectly still, and he looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they have already calculated. "Welcome to Iron Crest," he said. That was all. The ceremony happened that evening. It was short and without decoration. An elder bound their wrists with a silver cord and spoke the old words, and both of them repeated what they were told to repeat, and when the cord was removed, the peace between their packs was official. Sarah felt the same strange vibration she had felt at the border, stronger now, a warm hum that ran from her wrist up her arm and settled behind her heart like it intended to stay there. She did not mention it to anyone. She was given her own wing of the fortress. It was larger than her entire house in Silver Hollow, which she found both impressive and slightly absurd. She did not spend much time in it. She was not the kind of person who stayed in rooms. The first week, she learned the layout of the fortress. The second week, she started showing up to things. The kitchens in the morning, where she helped when they let her, and watched when they didn't. The training grounds in the afternoon, where she sat on the fence and studied how Iron Crest soldiers moved and whether they were better or worse than she had expected. They were better. She made a note of this. The third week, she walked into Chaol's war council. Nobody removed her. Nobody invited her either. She sat in the back row and listened to reports about border tensions with the Eastern Territories, and when the meeting ended, she asked one of the junior advisors a question about supply routes that apparently nobody had thought to ask before, because 3 people turned to look at her with expressions that suggested they were revising something. Chaol, from the head of the table, said nothing, but she noticed him notice her. She also noticed that he took his coffee without sugar, but reached for the honey when he thought no one was watching. She noticed that he visited the wounded soldiers on the 3rd floor of the East Wing every Tuesday without announcement. She noticed the scar on the inside of his left wrist, old and silver white, that he always covered with his cuff without seeming to think about it. The same wrist. The same place her skin had hummed on the night of the binding. She began to dream. The dreams were pieces of something. A forest. Pine trees, very tall, the light coming through them in long gold bars, the smell of petrichor in cold air, 2 children running, a boy who laughed loudly, carelessly, like laughing was free, a girl with dark hair who was trying to keep up with him and was furious that she couldn't quite manage it. Sarah would wake from these dreams with an ache she couldn't explain. She knew the forest wasn't Silver Hollow. She didn't know where it was. She didn't know the children, or she told herself she didn't, because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to look at directly. She wrote to her grandmother, Elder Marin. She described the dreams without explaining why she was asking. Her grandmother wrote back a single line. Some bonds are older than the people who carry them. Sarah read this several times, and then set the letter down and went to find something useful to do. A diplomatic summit brought pack representatives to Ironcrest in the 4th week. Among them was Lyra, the alpha of the West Fen pack, sharp-faced, composed, and possessed of the particular ease around Kale that suggested a long and comfortable history. She was the kind of woman who made other women feel like they had arrived to a conversation that had already been decided. She found Sarah near the east courtyard and smiled pleasantly. A political bride, she said. How practical. He'll set you aside once the treaty no longer serves him. He always moves on when something has served its purpose. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Then I suppose I'll have to make myself more than a purpose, she said, and walked away. But the words stayed with her. That evening, unable to sleep, she went to the fortress library. It was large and poorly organized, and she liked it immediately. She pulled histories and old ledgers without a clear goal, looking for something to stand on, something that was hers in this place that did not yet feel like home. She found it by accident, in a record book so old the spine had given up entirely. A ledger from 22 years ago, a record of a boundary agreement between Ironcrest and Silver Hollow, resolved through a short child exchange program, a common practice in that era, meant to build trust between packs. Ironcrest had sent a boy, 7 years old, listed only as the Alpha's son. Silver Hollow had sent a girl, 6 years old, listed as the Beta's daughter. There was a note at the end of the entry. The girl had returned home early, following a fever. The fever had caused partial memory loss. She had been unable to remember the details of her visit clearly. Sarah sat very still for a long time. She was Silver Hollow's Beta's daughter. She was 24 years old now, which meant she had been 6 years old, 22 years ago. She had been sent to Ironcrest. She had gotten sick. She had come home not remembering. She had spent a season in this fortress. She had spent a season with a boy who had storm-gray eyes and laughed like laughing was free. Her wolf, which had been still and watchful for weeks, stood up inside her like a fire being lit from a very old ember. She went to find Kale. It was past midnight. She did not care. He answered his chamber door in a plain shirt with no collar. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like a man who had been waiting, though she could not have said for what. She held up the ledger. He looked at it. He looked at her. The wall behind his eyes, the practiced, architectural wall she had been studying for a month, developed a visible crack. You knew, she said. I suspected, since the ceremony. And you said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, but the words underneath it were not. What would I have said? That I believe you may be the girl who came here when we were children, that I never took a mate in all these years, because something in me was always waiting for something I couldn't name. That I think the reason your wrist hummed on the night of our binding is the same reason mine did, and has every day since? Silence stretched between them. That, Sarah said, would have been a reasonable place to start. He almost smiled. It was the smallest movement, the corner of his mouth, a shift of something in his eyes, but it changed his entire face. He looked younger. He looked like the boy in the dream, just briefly, in the way that people sometimes look exactly like who they used to be when they forget to look like who they have become. He told her what he remembered. He had been 7 when she arrived at Ironcrest. They had spent 1 season together, running through the pine forest, arguing with the specific intensity that children argue when they are very similar and too young to know it, building a private understanding between themselves that required no explanation. When she got sick and had to leave early, he had cried for the first time in his life. He was not embarrassed about this. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. His father had told him the connection was childish feeling and would pass. It had not passed. He had simply stopped talking about it. "Are you telling me I'm your mate?" Sarah asked. "Your first mate?" "I'm telling you," he said, "that I don't know how to be objective about anything when you are standing in my doorway at midnight, looking like a question I have been failing to answer since you arrived." "That isn't actually an answer." "Yes," he said. "Yes, I believe you are." She did not fall into his arms. She was not built that way, and she would not have respected herself if she had been. She told him clearly, a fate bond was not the same as a choice. Memory was not permission. She had not come to Ironcrest to belong to anyone. She had come to protect her people, and she would not exchange one kind of cage for a prettier one just because it smelled familiar. Cale did not argue with her. He agreed. He said he had waited 22 years without knowing what he was waiting for. He could wait longer and do it honestly, and she could choose this freely or not at all, and either way, he would not make her feel the weight of it. She went back to her room. She lay awake for a long time. Then she slept, and she dreamed of the pine forest, and the boy turned around and had Cale's face, and when she reached for his hand, she did not wake up frightened. She woke up quiet, and certain, and a little undone. What followed was not a romance from a story. It was slower, and more ordinary, and more real. He left books outside her door, texts she had mentioned needing. She continued showing up to his war council, and eventually stopped sitting in the back row. He asked her opinion on a supply dispute one afternoon, and genuinely used her answer. She brought meals to the wounded soldiers, and learned their names, and remembered their families. And slowly, steadily, Ironcrest's people began to look at her differently, not as a political arrangement, but as someone who saw them. One evening in the library, surrounded by the books that had started everything, he asked her to tell him about Silver Hollow. She talked for 2 hours. He sat across from her, and listened the way very few people had ever listened to her, completely, without interrupting, without waiting for his turn to speak, as though what she was saying was the only thing happening in the world. No one had ever listened to her like that. She began to understand what choosing felt like, as distinct from arriving. The danger came quietly, as danger often does. Lyra had not visited Ironcrest only for diplomacy. She had been working, in secret, with a faction inside Silver Hollow, men who believed Sarah had been surrendered against her will and wanted to use that belief to restart the war, with her name as their reason. Sarah found out when she intercepted a message intended for General Oren that was not supposed to exist. She brought it directly to Cale, not because she needed him to handle it, because they were, she had come to understand, a unit, and units did not carry things alone. They addressed it together. Cale handled the external pressure. Sarah handled Silver Hollow's faction herself, appearing before them without warning and speaking plainly. She had not been surrendered. She had volunteered. She was not suffering. She was not a symbol for their anger. If they wanted to fight, they would have to find another reason, because she would not be it. The faction collapsed. Lyra was removed from the Dominion. The last thread of the old war, finally, came loose. The first snow of winter came the week after. Sarah stood in the courtyard and let it fall on her upturned face, and thought about the fact that she had come here to end a war, and had, perhaps, also built something. She was still considering this when Cale came to stand beside her. "You didn't need me," he said. There was wonder in his voice, not disappointment. "No," she said, "but I wanted you there. That's different." She held out her left wrist, the one that had hummed the night of their binding, the one that had quietly insisted on the truth for weeks before her mind caught up. He took it. His thumb moved over the inside of her wrist, over the place where the bond had always lived, invisible and patient. "I'm not staying because of a treaty," she told him. "I'm not staying because of a fate bond I didn't ask for. I am staying because I looked at you, and then I looked again, and then I chose. That is the only reason that matters to me. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way voices go when they are holding more than they can easily carry. "I have understood the difference for 22 years. She pulled him down by the collar and kissed him in the snow, and the bond that had waited patiently since they were children, in pine forests, in fever dreams, in 22 years of not quite knowing what was missing, finally, without ceremony, without drama, simply settled. Like something that had always been true, finally being said out loud.